Good afternoon, everyone. This is John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University. Thanks for joining another installment of our series, Understanding Our New World. And today we're deeply privileged to be joined by one of the really most interesting and compelling and impressive writers in America today, Candice Millard. Candice is a native of Ohio. She went to undergraduate school at Baker University, which is outside of Kansas City, has a graduate degree from Baylor, worked for several years at National Geographic as a writer and editor, and we'll ask her about that. She's also the author of 3 really terrific books, which are on my bookshelf and I will brandish. The first one is called The River of Doubt, which is about Teddy Roosevelt. We will talk about that. The second one is called Destiny of the Republic, about James Garfield. We will discuss that as well. And the most recent book is called Hero of the Empire about Winston Churchill and in a moment in his career that we don't really know very much about. So all 3 of them are really interesting characters, and Candice's work is characterized by rigorous research, great writing, and really compelling storytelling. So with that, Candice, we're delighted to have you with us today.
Hi, John. Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Great. Well, Candice, I've seen you in a couple conferences talk about yourself growing up, and you referred to, I mentioned you grew up in Ohio as kind of a library kid, and you say some of your most delightful memories are going to the local library and grabbing a book, and maybe on a nice sunny spring day going out and sitting out front and reading it. And so tell us about books and libraries, and also you tell a wonderful story about the first book that you actually got. Tell us that story.
So I was very lucky. It's interesting working at National Geographic because I worked with a lot of people who came from very different backgrounds from me, and many of them went to Ivy League schools and, sort of traveled the world and had exciting backgrounds. But I always say I would never trade my childhood with anyone. So as you say, I grew up in this little town in Ohio. It was largely working class town. 3 sisters, wonderful parents, just a quiet life. And the center of it was the library. My parents were always very, very big readers, and just for fun. I mean, there was never this sense that, they never told us to read. There were always books around our house because we always went to the library, and we could walk there from our house. And there's a little Quick Trip next to, I think it was like Stop and Go, and we get some candy, we go get our new book. And there, it was a little 2-story brick building, and I still remember the smell of it and the creaky wood floors and the little children's room in the front with the big windows. It's a huge, huge part of my childhood. And so the story you're referring to was very, very much shaped my life as a writer, and I think who I am. And it was just one of these kind of things that happened. So one day I went to the library with my family, and when I walked in, there was a rack there of some books that they were giving away. And it was one of these vertical revolving racks. And they had the word free on front of it. So it was books that you could actually keep for yourself. And so I ran over and I asked my mom, can I have one of these books? And she was like, sure. So I remember very vividly, I was maybe 10 years old, maybe 11, turning this rack and looking at these books, and they were adult books. They were books for adults. And I didn't know any of them, but there was one that caught my eye, and it was called I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. And I just liked the title. I had never heard of this book. I had never heard of Maya Angelou. I liked the title. I liked the picture on the cover. So I pulled it out and I put it in my pocket. And when we started walking home, I started reading it. And, I'm sure you've read that book. So many of us have. And it's just this extraordinary, extraordinary book. And even as a child, I connected with it in this very deep, visceral way. But I mean, there are a lot of things that I didn't understand in it, and a lot of things that kind of scared me. But for the first time, I realized that books could be more than just, school books, more than just educational. They can be more than just fun. They could be, it was my first experience with literature. They could be really profound and beautiful, and they could transport you and just to somewhere you had never been. And it was this really extraordinary experience for me. And again, it's not that I was like, oh, Maya Angelou, and I had no idea who she was. But I still have that book to this day. I'm 54 years old, and I know exactly where it is in my bookcase at home. And it's still, just one of my treasured possessions.
I've seen you in a couple conferences talk about saying at one point you had maybe thought about being an English professor, but you said that as you maybe got more into the graduate work, the focus on literary criticism turned you off. It was like, rather than just reading books for enjoyment, it was reading them to find flaws and so forth. Tell us about how that shifted. While you continue to love books, your interest in the kind of academic approach to English turned you off.
Right. So growing up, I didn't know anyone who was a writer. It didn't honestly even occur to me that I could be a writer. So I thought, okay, I love to read. I love books. I'll be a librarian or I'll be a teacher. And then when I went to college, I got my degree in English education. So I thought I was going to be a high school teacher. Then I decided I want to, go on and my plan is to get a PhD in English and become a college professor, an English professor. And I enjoyed my master's program, but like you said, the emphasis was on literary criticism at that time, and I think it still is. My oldest daughter is a freshman in college this year, and she also loves to read and loves to write. But I was talking to her about, do you want to be an English major? And I think she's going to major in anthropology, because the emphasis, and this is not at all to criticize that theory, that thought, that approach to literature. I admire it. But for me, it kind of takes some of the joy out of reading, because I love reading so much and it's so much a part of my life. And it's not even just looking for flaws, but it's breaking it down and reading something into it that the author never intended. I mean, often you're discouraged from any when you're writing about this, there's any biographical details, any historical details to try to understand what was going on at the time when it was written, both in the larger world and in this writer's life. It's purely the text and what you can kind of extract from it, not what the author intended, but they kind of discourage that. And obviously the kind of writing that I ended up doing, it's all about context. It's all about trying to understand what people were thinking, what was going on, why they made the decisions that they did, and why it led where it led. So to me, I really didn't like it. And just me personally, it wasn't for me. And I didn't want to teach that way either. And I knew that it's a very, very competitive field. There are a lot of brilliant, brilliant professors, the push to publish and everything. And I knew it was just not the kind of publishing that I wanted to do. So I was in Texas. I moved back home to Kansas City, moved back in with my parents, didn't have a penny to my name, just trying to get a job.
Well, speaking of jobs, I mean, the one job that you refer to a lot in your talks is just National Geographic, and how that shaped you in terms of your approach to research, to writing, to storytelling. Tell us about your time at National Geographic.
So that was my dream job. I was living in Kansas City. I was working for a trade journal company, and I was, I think, 27, 28 years old, and I wanted to change my life, do something big, and I didn't know how to make that happen. But I had, at that time, they had a 1-800 number for if there were any jobs at National Geographic. So this is, 1995. It's a long time ago. So I would call this 1-800 number every day, and there were never any jobs available. So I later find out that really the human resources department at National Geographic is to keep people out, because there's so many people who want a job there. And like so many things, it ends up being who you know, right? Somebody knows who's already working there, there's a job, and they'll tell you and you tell somebody else. So what happened, I always laugh, it's my husband, who was then my boyfriend, it was my boyfriend's college roommate's twin brother's friend literally told me about an opening at National Geographic. So I was actually thinking about joining the Peace Corps at that time. And this guy, the college roommate's twin brother, had spent a lot of time in the Peace Corps in Sierra Leone. And so he was like, look, the headquarters are here. Why don't you come take, there was an opening in Madagascar. Why don't you come talk to them? This is a big change. So I had no money. Again, I was making like $18,000 a year. I remember putting that on my credit cards, and but I was like, I'm just going to take this investment in my future. And so when I got to DC, he said, if you could do anything, what would you do? And I said, I'd work at National Geographic, but I have no idea how to make that happen. He said, well, I have a friend who works in the education department there. So we had lunch with him, this Roger Herschel, and his name was, he passed away a few years ago, unfortunately, but wonderful, became one of my best friends. And he told me about a job in the TV division and as a researcher. I wanted to be on the magazine, but TV was really interesting too. Obviously, they're documentaries, and it was a foot in the door, which is often all you need, So amazingly, I got that job. I moved to DC, and I worked in that job for maybe 8 months. Until there was an opening on the magazine for something called a legends writer. And that's basically writing the captions for the stories, but it's hugely important because, as we know, if we're honest, most people, when they read National Geographic, they look at the pictures, which are, world class, right? And they read the legends, right? And sometimes they read the articles, but anyway, so they had a whole team of writers who did that, and they had a test when they had an opening. They had a test, and it was anonymous. And that's one of the things I always say that's so great about writing. It's a meritocracy. It doesn't matter where you went to college. It doesn't matter who your parents were. It doesn't matter if you have money or not, or what you look like. Can you write or not? That's all that matters. And so for this test, I was just a nobody in the research department over in TV. And I took this test. 300 people took this test. They give you the article, the layout, and a couple of weeks to do your own research and write the captions. And I got the job. And it was, I always say, it was like my wedding, when I had my children, and getting the job at National Geographic. Those are like the big highlights of my life. It was a very big day for me. And I loved it. So I was there for another 5 years, and I was an editor, and then I would beg and beg and beg. And every once in a while, they would, just to shut me up, they would let me go on assignment. So it was amazing.
Well, Candice, let's maybe shift a little bit to kind of writing specifically. And I was looking at an article that you wrote, maybe it was about 10 years ago in the Post, called The Writing Life. And I want to read a couple sentences and then just maybe have you play off it. You said, if I've learned anything about nonfiction writing, it is that the challenge is not in finding a great story to tell. More often than not, real life is so rich, complex, and unpredictable that it would seem completely implausible in the pages of a novel. The difficulty lies in understanding people that you're writing about, not their actions or even their thoughts, but their deepest character. It is not the famous events, the dramatic moments of public triumph that define them. It is when their lives are difficult, even desperate, that their true nature is revealed. Talk about how that perspective informs your writing, as we'll talk about Roosevelt, Garfield, and Churchill in a second, but that sense of character being defined by adversity.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was actually just talking to a friend about this. I remember, when I was working on my first book, The River of Doubt, and it's about this trip that Theodore Roosevelt took down this unmapped river in the Amazon and nearly died on this trip, and his son was with him. And it's really a miracle that any of them survived this expedition. So I had been working on it for a number of years. I had gone to the river, and I was obviously found it very, very stressful because I had never written a book, didn't know if I could pull it off. So I was in the final proofs of that book, and I was expecting my second child. And I got a call one day. They had seen something on a recent sonogram, and I had to come back in for a more detailed sonogram, and they found a tumor in my baby, in the fetus, a mass, and I had to have her that day. And so, and my editor didn't even know that I was pregnant because I thought I still had a few weeks, and I was like, it doesn't matter, I'll have the baby and I can get it all done. But I had to call him and say, I'm having a baby today. I need more time because, it was the final proofs were due. So anyway, I had her, and she had what's called neuroblastoma. She had stage 4 cancer, and was born with it. And so my husband and I, our family, were just thrust into this world where we're terrified that she was given a 30% chance of survival. And so I've just had a C-section. I have this baby in a different hospital. We're trying, everybody's everywhere. And I've got these proofs that I'm going through. And when I was reading through Roosevelt and all that he went through, I suddenly understood it in such a different way. There's my newborn baby connected to all these beeping instruments and things. And all I want is for her to survive. And I realized I just understood Roosevelt so much better, the decisions that he made, because all he wanted was for his son to survive this trip, And so at one point, he nearly took his own life because he was so sick, he thought he would be a danger to the other men. And the only reason he didn't is he realized the best way to save his son was to let his son save him. And his son was really the hero of this trip, and really with his determination and his skills and his background and his strength, got everyone out. And I had never really thought about it in that way. I thought of this book as, adventure and exploration and the science behind it, but I had never really, really thought about that human connection, that point at which someone is, as you said, someone's struggling and they're desperate and they're scared, or with Garfield, they're dying. And that is when you truly see who they are. You truly understand their character. And that's also where we can connect with them. That's why we can really, it doesn't matter how long ago they lived or how different their life was. We all understand that we've all had those emotions, and that's where we can really connect and understand. And that's what I'm interested in. That's what I always want to try to find in any book that I write.
Well, in your book, there's a couple, I think, hallmarks of your writing. I mean, some really amazing central characters, as you say, in these kind of life and death struggles. But one thing I also like is I think the way you develop secondary characters. And I want to read, I was going over again your Churchill book, and I came across a couple references to his mother, and I want to read them to you and have you kind of play off them, because they're just delightful. That you say, her name is Jenny Churchill, and you call her blindingly beautiful with thick black hair and porcelain skin. She was said to be part Native American. She moved with an assurance and sensuality that made her an irresistible force to nearly every man she met and a threat to every woman. Jenny was well aware not only of her beauty, but of the power it gave her. She used it as both a weapon and a wand, breaking hearts and enthralling anyone who caught her eye. And then you later quote her son saying, "She shone for me like the evening star. I loved her dearly, but at a distance." Talk either about Jen Churchill, who's an amazingly interesting person, or even just the way secondary characters can kind of shape your story and drive your narrative.
Right. Secondary characters are hugely important. For one thing, they help you understand your central characters, right? You need their commentary about them and their interaction with so you can really understand whether it's, Churchill's arrogance or his vulnerability or his brilliance or whatever it is, his daring, whatever it is you're trying to understand. You can't just say it, right? You need to understand it within the context, and there's no one better than someone very close to that person, and especially his mother, who I remember meeting with someone when I was doing the research in London. This guy who was British, and we were talking about Jenny, and I said, she was a real piece of work. And he was like, "Oh, I love that American saying." I was like, "Oh, I didn't even know it was just American," but it fits her perfectly. I mean, she really was a piece of work. And I was torn about her because I admired her to some degree, but she was very smart and very kind of courageous in her own way and doing her own thing. But as a mother myself, it was difficult, because she loved him and he loved her, but from a distance, and again, I always say, I wouldn't trade my childhood for anyone's. I certainly wouldn't trade it for Winston Churchill's, because he, was always thrown to these horrible, horrible boarding schools, and he was alone, and all he wanted was to spend time with his parents. He admired his father so much. And but his father never had time for him. He's had this huge political career, and his mother, he wanted to be with her, but she didn't have time either. She was always, there were always social events and things, and he would write them the most wrenching letters saying, I'm giving this presentation. Will you please come? And he would even like chart out the train schedules. If you take this train and this train, then you can be back in London by this time in time for your party or whatever. And they just never came. They never came. And his father only paid attention when he thought he wasn't good enough, and he would write him the cruelest letters. And his mother started to pay attention after his father died, and he started to become interesting in his own right, about the time that this story takes place that I write about. So she became useful to him, helping him get assignments and things in the military, because she knew everybody, because all these men were in love with her. But also, she was interested in him because he was now he was an adult, right? And he was writing and he was thinking, and he was interesting to her. So it was a very, very interesting relationship that they had. But you're right, those I always say you have to have great central characters, of course, but you really have to look about who's surrounding them and find out where their archives are, where their papers are. They will tell you so much more about the person you're trying to know.
Well, central characters go, Teddy Roosevelt is pretty good.
Yeah.
And in the story you tell, he's just come off the 1912 campaign in which he tried to return to the White House. He lost a crushing defeat. And as you say, he did what he often did when he suffered defeat, which was just get busy, take risks, go crazy. Right. So he embarks on this remarkable trip, a former president of the United States, going down this uncharted river tributary of the Amazon. Tell the story and just what it was about it that just pulled you in so deeply.
So I was working at National Geographic at the time, and had gotten married and was actually expecting my first child, and thought, I should probably live with my husband at some point. That'd probably be a good idea. He was living in Kansas City. He had his own company. He had been a foreign correspondent with the New York Times for years, but had left to start his own company in Kansas City. So anyway, I love Kansas City. I wanted to move here, but I really love my job at National Geographic. I didn't know what I could do in Kansas City that I would love as much. And he's the one who said, you should write a book. And I thought, much easier said than done. And anyway, so I didn't know if I could do it, but I started to look for ideas. And I was having lunch with a friend who wrote a book about the election of 1912. And he said, have you ever heard of this trip that Roosevelt took down this unmapped river in the Amazon? And I'll never forget, because I had read a couple of biographies about Roosevelt, but every book, most biographies, they give you maybe a few paragraphs about it, because it's after his active political career. So there just really wasn't that much interest in it. But I remember this friend of mine, James Chase, reading a passage about this trip, and he said, and the river is called the River of Doubt. There's your title. And so I went back to work. National Geographic has obviously a wonderful library. And I just started doing a little research, and I was like, oh my God, this trip is incredible. So it's this river that's nearly 1,000 miles long, and it's a central tributary of the Amazon River. And it was on any map of the world. And a man died there, and another man was murdered, and Roosevelt nearly took his own life. It's just incredible. And I can write about the Amazon, and I can write about evolution and all of these things that I'd been steeping myself in at National Geographic. So anyway, it sold pretty quickly. But so the idea, so Roosevelt, here he is. He had been president, a partial term when McKinley was killed, and then he had won in his own right. And he said, I'm not going to run again. And he went to Africa on this big, exploring this big natural history expedition. And he gets back and he's really unhappy with what's going on in the White House. And so he decides to run himself. But of course, what he does is he splits the Republican Party and he puts Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, in the White House for the first time in 16 years. And everybody's furious with him. So, so he, like you said, every time he came against, you know, when he lost his father, or when his mother and his wife died on the same night, all of these difficult, unimaginable tragedies that happened in his life, he always threw himself into something really difficult and physically strenuous and dangerous to try to forget. And so he's a pariah for the first time in his life. He's not used to losing. He's given this opportunity to go on a speaking tour to South America. He gets there and they say, well, you can, you know, kind of go on a natural history trip while you're here, or we found the headwaters of this river and nobody knows where it goes. You could do that. And I mean, it's Theodore Roosevelt. He's not going to say no to that, right? Even though he's completely unprepared. So anyway, it was just this unbelievable journey. And I mean, he came very, very close to dying in the Amazon.
Well, and one of the kind of central tensions of your book is between he's sharing the leadership of this voyage with a Brazilian explorer, Claudio
Rondon.
Rondon. And Rondon wants to take its time and map the river and do this in a very methodical, scientific way. And Roosevelt wants to get down there. It's like anyone who's been on a family vacation, which people have two different agendas, can kind of appreciate just sort of the tension that just kind of jumps out of your pages. Is
right.
Because Roosevelt, they're running out of provisions. He's feeling horrible. It's raining. Bugs are everywhere. He just wants to get done.
Right, they're losing canoe after canoe in these unbelievable rapids. You know, you think about the Amazon River is very wide and quiet, but this is one of these rivers that's coming down out of the highlands, and it's fast and twisting and full of rapids. And they're in basically hauled out tree trunks, because of course they got there without any boats. And they have the Cinta Larga are, you know, attacking, and so it's unbelievably dangerous. And several men died on the trip. And he's like, let's just get there, find out where it goes, and we can put it on the map. But Rondon, as you say, had spent his life mapping and trying to understand the Amazon and stringing a telegraph line through it. And he was very methodical. But he insisted, and he took all these coordinates, and they were very precise. So when I went there to see this river, I had a GPS, right? And I could dial up these coordinates and I could see exactly where everything happened. They're very, very precise. He was right.
Well, when you did the research trip, I mean, what was that like? In your notes, you acknowledge a guide who you said did, you know, remarkable help in getting you through it. I mean, it must have just given you a really tangible sense of what the challenge you faced was.
Yeah, I mean, I always say the research is my favorite part of this job. It's so much fun, and I'm so lucky that I'm able to do it. So getting to this river was very hard, because most of it is in protected indigenous territory, the Cinta Larga, and you're supposed to, in theory, be able to go through and like get their permission, but there's no way. I talked to the New York Times bureau chief there, and he was like, I've tried it, it just doesn't happen, they don't. But I was able to find a little fishing village on the banks, kind of farther north, but on the banks of this river, and that's in just general Brazilian territory. And there's this little, I say fishing village, it's really just a camp. So they, as you might imagine, those waters are very pristine. And this guy was hoping to attract fishermen who loved, the piranhas were literally this big in this river. So I was able to stay there and go up and down the river from there, and also fly over the whole thing. But I mean, it's incredibly, incredibly dangerous place still today. You know, we worry about losing the Amazon, and we should. I mean, and we are losing so much of it, and it's a real problem. But when you're there and when you're flying over it, I mean, it's just so vast and so dense and so breathtakingly beautiful. But in some ways, you know, the Amazon protects itself. So one day we had just hired this little plane, And we had an inexperienced pilot for a series of reasons. We lost our more experienced pilot. We got this more inexperienced. And we had been in a rubber tapping village, and it's a rainforest. It was burning in the rainy season, so there's a lot of moisture in the air. And we got back to the plane. He didn't sump the water out of the tank, so we got in. We're flying. Those little planes they're very noisy and stuff. We're about 1,500 feet up, and the single engine went out because the water got into the engine, and we just started falling. And I remember thinking, if we crash, I hope we die because they will never find us. They will never find us. We were just in the middle of nowhere. And amazingly, I mean, you hear about people being able to restart an engine in flight. I'd never seen it happen, and he did. I mean, it was a young guy, the pilot, and he was clawing at the controls, and he got it started, and we went on our way. But not long after that, maybe just a couple of months, a couple of freelance photographers for National Geographic were killed in a plane crash over the Rio Negro. So yeah, it happens, but it was an extraordinary experience. And like you said, I mean, there are so many things that you can't understand unless you go to these places. For instance, so you think, okay, here's Theodore Roosevelt. He's been hunting his entire life. Here's Rondon. He spent his whole life in the Amazon. And this is the richest ecosystem on Earth. Why are they starving? Why are they starving? And you go there and it's silent. It's really silent. And you can't see anything that you can eat. I mean, they're like a few monkeys way in the canopy, maybe some caiman kind of disappearing into the river. Everything's eating you while you're just eating alive. But anything you can eat, I mean, it's evolution. They're just really good at either, being a predator or not being prey, both of which involves hiding.
Well, a very different person that you chronicled is James Garfield. In fact, you've done probably more than anyone to revive interest in James Garfield. Tell us why he's such a remarkable person.
So he was one of these stories. Yeah, I think my editor was shocked when I told him I wanted to write about James Garfield after this trip. I think they're expecting another adventure, and he's like, okay, But I fell in love with him. So I wanted another book with a lot of science in it. So I was actually researching Alexander Graham Bell, and I just came upon this story of him trying to save Garfield after Garfield was shot. And I was surprised that I had never heard. It was like Alexander Graham Bell was trying to save the president, one of our only 4 presidents who had been assassinated. How do I not know this? And also, why did Bell do that? I mean, Bell was young. He was had some money for the first time. He was famous. He had all these ideas, and he dropped everything to try to help Garfield. So I thought, I wonder what Garfield was like, because like most Americans, unfortunately, all I knew about him was that he had been assassinated. And I think most of us think, oh, he's just this bearded, Gilded Age president, nothing, not interesting. Too bad he died. So I started researching him, and I was blown away. He was absolutely brilliant. So he's our last president to be born in a log cabin. His father died before he was 2 years old. He didn't have shoes in Ohio until he was 4. His mother and his brother saved so that he could go to school because they knew he was so smart. And so he went to this small school, Hiram, in Ohio. But he was so brilliant that by his sophomore year, while he was still a student, he was a sophomore in college, they made him a professor of literature, mathematics, and ancient languages. He knew the entire Aeneid by heart in Latin. When he was in Congress, he wrote an original proof of the Pythagorean theorem. And I always say he had a heart to match his mind. So he was a fierce abolitionist. He hid a runaway slave. His speech on behalf of Black suffrage on the floor of Congress will break your heart. And it was central to bringing about Black suffrage. He was a hero in the Civil War for the Union Army. So he was just absolutely brilliant and brave, and he didn't want to be president. He was thrust into this role. So when he became president, he had this power that I don't think any other president has had, because he didn't owe anyone anything. You know, he hadn't kind of sold the soul along the way. He was like, all right, I'll do this, but I'm going to do it my way.
Well, yeah, and you tell also the story, I mean, of his assassination, his shooting, and the fact that he was shot seriously, but
Right.
the doctors, you know, a team of doctors, maybe a little bit of turf war going on, basically infected him seriously. And as you write, you know, had they just even left him alone, he probably would have lived. You know,
Yeah.
modern science would have had him out within weeks.
Hmm.
But you also chronicle, as he is dying and wasting away, that he still conducted himself with enormous dignity and decency and kindness. And it was just
Hmm.
almost an example of what you had said earlier about revealing character through adversity.
Right. And he said, and always, this phrase has always stayed with me, because it perfectly summarizes what I'm trying to say about what you see in a person. He said it's and he was talking about when someone is ill, he said it's the bed of the sea. Everything else is stripped away and you see the bed of the sea. You see who this person is. And everybody who knew and loved him said he was his purest self. He was, you know, here he was dying and suffering. I mean, his body was riddled with infection. You know, he lost half of his body weight. I mean, the death mask that they have at his home in Ohio will break your heart. And he was so concerned about everyone else, not just his family, but about his friends, and so grateful for all that they were doing to try to save him, or even just to make him comfortable.
Yeah. Well, the third character let's talk about for a few minutes is Winston Churchill. And of course, well known, but you pick him up at a point in his life that maybe many of us don't know that much about. He's 24, you know, full of aspiration, trying to find a way to make it in the world. Looks at the military and then ends up going to the Boer War as a war correspondent, is captured, becomes a POW. Pick it up from there.
So he's he's in escort in South Africa, and just dying to get in the war, because he called military success, military medals, the glittering gateway to distinction, because he thought, that's how I'm going to distinguish myself, and that's how I'm going to win the next election, because he had already run for parliament and lost. So he's desperate to find a way to have this path to power, right? And to distinguish himself. So he's on this armored train, and he's the only civilian on it. And like you said, he's 24 years old, and it's attacked by these Boers, and men are dying, you know, arms being shot off right and left. And Winston Churchill, this kid, who again, he's at this point is not even in the military, he immediately takes command and starts shouting orders. You do this. And it's like the audacity. But what's even more incredible is that people listen. These soldiers, these officers listened to him, and they did what he asked. And those who made it out alive credited him. They said it was because of Winston Churchill, because he kept his head and he had such confidence and he knew what to do. And I always say that's what was so interesting about him, his leadership, because his confidence was contagious. You know, he's like, I know I can do it, and you know you can do it too. And when he tells you can do it, you believe it. And obviously that comes into play in a major way 40 years later with World War II. But so he's put into this. He's captured though. He's put into this POW camp in Pretoria, and he escapes by himself. He makes it across almost 300 miles of enemy territory without a map, a compass, food, a weapon. He didn't speak the language. I mean, it's extraordinary. And with the Boers, who are furious because he was famous, because his father was famous. So they were really proud of themselves for having captured him. And then he humiliates them. So they are searching high and low for him, and will probably kill him if they find him. But he amazingly makes it out to what's now Mozambique, was in Portuguese East Africa, and becomes this huge hero, and just turns it around very quickly, runs for parliament again, and wins. And that was the launching pad for Winston Churchill's political career.
But as you tell, I mean, you know, there's an aspect of Churchill that we sort of know, which is self-promotion and boasting and that sort of thing. But there's also, I mean, in this episode, I mean, you see kind of the toughness, the resilience, the humor, the luck too. But But I was struck by something, a note that you referred to that he wrote to his mother in describing himself. And he says, I know myself pretty well and am not blind to the tawdry and dismal side of my character. But if there's one situation in which I do not feel ashamed of myself, it is in the field. I mean,
Right.
as you say, he had this sense of confidence in his ability to navigate the world, basically.
Absolutely. Yeah. He used to say, I have faith in my star. And he certainly did, but and that's why I say I'm obviously a flawed person and who isn't, right? But obviously had his flaws. And you see those very clearly, definitely his arrogance very early on. But he could laugh at himself. He knew it and he would laugh and he was kind of irresistible. And people would be like, that kid gets on my last nerve, but he's going to be prime minister one day. People said that again and again and again. And yeah, absolutely. The determination, the resilience, the resourcefulness. And people think of him as an old man sending young men into war. But by that point, when he was 24 years old, that was his fourth war on 3 different continents. And he had already written 3 books. I mean, he was, incredibly prolific, but also incredibly personally brave.
And you say as he gets through and he survives, the first thing he does is join the army and goes back and almost incredibly helps rescue the POW camp that he had been detained in.
Right. He frees that same POW camp. And, I was in that building when I was talking about research, when I went to do research for this book, and I went to Victoria, and that building is now a public library. You can go in, but it's really cool because the room where Churchill stayed, there's a trap door in the floor where they had thought about digging their way out. I was standing in that trap door, and they have on the wall, it was an officer's prison, and all these officers were highly trained cartographers. And they had drawn a map of the war on the wall, and it's still there. It's kind of covered in plexiglass. But I went to where he was captured. The British consulate in Mozambique is still there. I went to where he hid along the way when he was escaping. He hid at a colliery in a coal mine shaft with these white rats for 3 days. And the colliery's gone, but the shaft is still there. And it's unfortunately there's a fire that's been going on for many years that they can't put out.
Well, yeah, and I won't spoil it for our readers, who I will encourage to really pick up your book today. But a critical part of the story takes place in a mine, and you're very, very evocative. And it's funny because I was looking at your notes, and you wrote this. You said, I would also like to thank the mining historian J. Davenport, who helped my research into South African mines, and whose carefully researched and fascinating book, Digging Deep, was an excellent resource for me. I'm imagining when you started this, you were not saying, I really want to learn about mines. But as you get pulled in this story, it's like, this is an essential thing to understand how he survived.
Right. And it wasn't just her. I mean, she was wonderful, but also I met this incredible guy there. John Bird was his name. And he had spent his career managing coal mines in the same part of South Africa. And he had been fascinated with the Churchill story and had done a lot of his own research. And he was just a wonderful resource, but he also connected me with other people. So I wanted to understand what was it like for Churchill down there. And I was picturing sort of cramped and dark and kind of sterile, but no, the passages are really wide because they had ponies down there, these poor ponies they would put down there for weeks. And so it smelled like pony down there too, So like you can really, or just at least better, I hope the reader could better understand exactly what it was like for him being down there in that pitch blackness, with these rats scurrying around.
Candice, as we wind down, I know, we have students here who are interested in reading, and as I've heard you talk and read some of your essays, I mean, a couple messages that you seem to convey a lot is that really encouraging people to sort of pursue the stories that are interesting to them. I mean, even if maybe others don't think so, but if this is what's interesting to you, plunge into it, and also take the time to do it right. And I know you have said, there are deadlines, and of course, in the academic world, you have to respect them, but particularly when you're writing a book, I mean, you want this book to endure. So if you miss a deadline by a couple months, your editor's not going to love you for it. But when you look at the book 10 years later, you're going to feel pretty good about it.
Absolutely. I'm a rule follower, so it's always very, very stressful. I always want to make deadline, but I always keep in mind, and everyone should keep in mind, no one's going to remember if you turn it on time. They're going to remember if it was good or not. So if you can make it better by being a couple of months late, or I'm always a year late, to be honest. I don't recommend that, but for each book, it's at least a year late. God bless my editor. But what matters is if it's good or not, and it takes time, spend time, first of all, on the idea. It has to be something you love, but it has to have a ton of primary research material and all those peripheral stories and characters that we were talking about, a ton of primary source material, but something that you're not going to mind. It takes me 4, 5, 6 years to write a book, and I have never resented a moment of it because I've found these stories fascinating all the way through, and I've learned so much that I knew starting out, because I put a lot of research in ahead of time, I knew that I was going to love working on it.
Candice, final question. If you were to take a trip, say from Kansas City to Carbondale for a book event, you have a new book, so we'd love to have you come. But if you could choose your traveling companion and your choices were Churchill, Roosevelt, and James Garfield, who would you choose?
I would choose Winston Churchill just because I think he'd be funny. I think he'd be deeply entertaining and he would have so many great stories. I always say Garfield has my heart. And I think, Roosevelt was a brilliant man. But Winston Churchill makes me laugh. I would really enjoy him.
Yes. That's great. Well, Candice, thank you so much for your time. We really do appreciate it. I know you've just finished a book and we are eager for that to come out. And when it does come out, and if you're doing a book tour, we'd love to invite you to Carbondale and meet with students and faculty and talk about your new book to the community here.
I would love to do that. Thank you so much, John. I really enjoyed the conversation. I thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Great, thank you. And thanks to all of you for watching another edition of our series, Understanding Our New World. We'll have this interview with Candice on our website by Monday, so please look at it, pass it on to friends, and encourage all your friends to read Candice's books. They are really terrific. It would be great summer reading. So please take my advice and read all of her books. Thanks so much, and thank you for keeping the legacy of Paul Simon alive and well.